Hello and welcome to video lecture 33. Today we'll be talking about a very important component of Hindi cinema, the Indian New Wave. So it's a very interesting movement that happened in India. It has some very interesting beginnings. We'll be delving into a lot of the details of that. But before we do that, let's do a quick recap of what we talked about in the last lecture. So in the last lecture, we delved into what is it that happened with cinema after India's independence? What kind of changes were seen in Indian cinema? We also talked about how nation building as a concept was taken forward or assimilated into the filmmaking process. Finally, we also talked about the golden age of cinema and what were the kind of stories that were being told during this time, who were the prominent filmmakers and some important films of the time. In today's lesson, we'll be talking about the Indian New Wave. So, what kind of cinema is it that that was being produced under this particular movement? What were the characteristics of parallel cinema, which actually is another name for Indian New Wave? And we'll also again discuss the important filmmakers as well as some important films made by these particular made by these filmmakers, and what were the dominant themes that come under your parallel cinema. So, what are the objectives of this particular lecture? By the end of this lecture, you would have studied how is it that the Indian New Wave actually came to arise, what were the reasons that a certain kind of cinema was being made. You will also be able to understand the influences and the factors that were responsible for this particular cinema, another name for parallel cinema, which is also known as alternative cinema. You'll also be able to define the characteristics that are very specific to this cinema and the films and the filmmakers of the time. So, let's now delve into what is meant by parallel cinema. So, I'll just give you a brief overview. Now, please understand that we are using the term parallel. So, what does parallel mean? Parallel would mean that there is already that exists and there's something that is running alongside it. So, parallel cinema is the kind of cinema that came into existence while a certain kind of cinema was already dominant. So, we'll delve into all of that, but what is this dominant cinema? What was this mainstream cinema that parallel cinema started coming up to? So, now the 1960s started with a huge bang. Mughal-e-Azam, this magnum opus by K. Asif was released in the year 1960. And what it did was that it had one film, like in the entire film, in the entire length of the film, there was one song that was shot in Technicolor, and that made huge waves with the audiences. Color had of course come into the Indian industry, film industry in 1937, but it was only towards in the 50s, in the late 50s, that color finally started to appear on the screen. And in 1960, it came on with a big bang when Mughal-e-Azam released. And because Mughal-e-Azam had been in production for a long amount of time, the entire film couldn't have been made in color. So there was this one song, and that one particular song, there are legends that say that the entire budget for that one particular song, Pyar Kiya To Darna Kya, was more than the entire budget for any one film at that particular time of the contemporary times. So Mughal-e-Azam made a huge impact with the audiences. It was a massive commercial hit, and what it did was that it set in motion a certain kind of cinema, a certain type of a cinema. So while in the 50s, the angst and the apprehension of the newly independent Indian state was visible, what happened in the 60s was that it was replaced by this very buoyant and jovial exuberance, and this very laid back kind of an attitude. Fun films were being made, which is why the 60s are also referred to a couple of times to as the swinging 60s. So this was the change that happened from the 50s to the 60s. There was this very marked difference in the kind of content that was now being made for the people. So the films that were made at this point of time, the themes that they explored, they're very light-hearted, very romantic plot lines, melodious songs with the actors and actresses, rolling around in the snow-clad Kashmir Valley or the Shimla Hills. So this was what the dominant image in the screens had become during the 60s. And all these films were massive commercial successes. The audience loved going to them, and this audience that the film business was catering to was actually very different from the one that was existing in the decade prior. Now, this particular audience was actually someone who, like a lot of people, had been born in a free nation. So there were young kids who did not really understand the concept of being ruled over by the British, and this overall atmosphere in the country was that of happiness, and therefore that is what was being reflected in the cinema also. So cinema was now, in the 60s, cinema was now being used as a means for entertainment, pure entertainment, as something that people would go out to watch, on an outing and enjoy song, dance. So that is what the cinema of that time was catering to. Now, if you look at the screen right now, you will see all through the 1960s there was some major films, and I'm sure you have heard of these films, because these films have been really like huge successes, as I've already mentioned, and they really did strike a chord with the audiences. The audience had a good time going to the cinemas, watching them. So in the 1960s, of course, you have, after Mughal-e-Azam, you have Barsat Ki Raat. You also have Chaundhvi Ka Chand. Now, Chaundhvi Ka Chand is a film that was directed by Guru Dutt. Guru Dutt had also made films in the 1940s that were about the social, that were more about the social commentary, and it has also largely been said that Chaundhvi Ka Chand is actually Guru Dutt's most contemporary kind of a film. Like it is most in alignment with the kind of mainstream cinema that was dominant at that time. Coming to 1961, you have, of course, Jangli and Ganga Jamuna. Jangli gave audiences the very energetic Shammi Kapoor. So the title itself, Jangli, is sort of about breaking barriers and just running out wild into the world. And so this particular film and the songs of this film really capture the essence of what the audience and what the atmosphere of the filmmaking industry was at that point of time. 1962, we have Mujhe Jeene Do, Sahib Bibi aur Gulam. 63, we move to Mehre Mehboob and Bandini. Bandini, of course, is also a film that is also said to be one of the early films that has a strong feminist stand. Moving to 1964, we have Sangam, Dosti. Again, as we keep on moving forward, Waqt, Guide, Love in Tokyo, Teesri Manzil, Jewel Thief, Upkar, Milan, Aankhein, Padosan, which was a comedy starring Sunil Dutt and Ashok Kumar and Mahmood, and also Saira Banu. And of course, in the year 1969, you also have the film Aradhana, which actually brought forth Rajesh Khanna, who's set to be the first superstar of the Indian film industry. So now, as we just recalled all these films that came into view, you will realize that they were all really fun films, happy-go-lucky films. With all these films had happy endings, a lot of song and dance, melodious music, and so these are the kind of films that were being made. In the 60s, perhaps the most number of very famous film actors and actresses, along with playback singers, came into the foray of Indian film industry. So all these names, including Dilip Kumar, Madhubala, Shammi Kapoor, to Asha Parekh, Sharmila Tagore, Rajesh Khanna, and then also moving on to singers, the playback singers like Mohammad Rafi, Lata Mangeshkar, Asha Bhosle, Manna Dey. All these people, they became really huge names during the 60s. So this is what this is what was the general mood of the 1960s. So now, as the industry moved into the late 1960s, there was a different kind of cinema that started to emerge, and this cinema was running parallel to the mainstream cinema that we have just talked about, and which is why it garnered the name parallel cinema. And this particular cinema was very different in terms of its structure, in terms of the kind of themes it explored, and the narratives that it chose to talk about. So all of this was very different than the mainstream cinema of the time. It did not align at all with the conventions that were present for the mainstream contemporary cinema of the time. So the early Indian new wave cinema is actually Bengali cinema, coming from the likes of people or directors like Satyajit Ray. Now, So this cinema that was emerging out of Bengal was different from the Hindi cinema that was emerging from Bombay, which was actually considered to be escapist entertainment meant for a larger audience. But the precursors for this cinema, as I have already said, existed in films like Dharti Ke Lal, Avara and Neecha Nagar. And directors with films from directors like Bimal Roy, K. Abbas and V. Shantaram, who did not think of films merely as meant for entertainment, but who understood the importance of films as tools for mass communication, for talking to a larger audience. So the films that were now being made under the parallel cinema, or that were beginning to come out of Bengal, were issue-based films, and they were then a reflection of the society that the people of the times were living in. So now let's move on to talking about the reasons or the catalysts that were actually responsible for this kind of a cinema to come up so strongly during the 1960s. So if you remember, in the last lesson we talked about the Film Inquiry Committee, which was set up in the year 1949. So in the year 1951, the committee had come out with a report, and it had certain recommendations. Now, what were these recommendations? Some of them I'll list them down for you. So one of the things that the committee suggested was the setting up of a financing body for films, so that films that were not looked at commercial successes, or that were not looked at financiers, but as being in line with mainstream cinema, could get some kind of a funding. So filmmakers who wanted to tell different stories would have some kind of an agency, some kind of a corporation where they could get funding to make their films. Another recommendation, a very important one, was that the setting up of a training institute for film technicians. So from directors, writers, actors, sound technicians, to all kinds of people who would be involved in different aspects of the filmmaking process. Another thing was that there should be some kind of a film festival, which of course was something that was implemented immediately when the first Indian International Film Festival was held. Another two very important suggestions, recommendations of the committee were the establishment of something of a national award for the filmmaking community, and finally a censor board that would certificate board actually that would be able to certificate different kind of films based on what kind of audiences the film could be shown to, could be referred to. So these were the recommendations of the committee, and some of them were really put forth. The earliest one, of course, was that in the year 1952, the Indian International Film Festival was organized. As for a financing body for films, that happened almost a decade later, in the year 1960. So in the form of the Film Finance Corporation that came into existence. In the later, of course, this particular corporation was changed, like the name was changed, and which today we know as the NFDC. The idea of setting up this Film Finance Corporation was that it would finance and promote films with a high artistic content. So when you say high artistic content, it was always assumed to be as separate from your mainstream cinema, where the filmmakers could feel free enough to experiment with the filmmaking project and talk about important issues in the society. In the following year, in the year 1961, the FTII was set up in Pune. So that then accomplished the task of setting up a training institute for film technicians, for film personnels. And an interesting fact about the FTII Institute is that it was set up in the erstwhile Prabhat Studio. We did talk about Prabhat Studio in the last lecture. So that's why FTII also, like in terms of the history of Indian cinema, FTII also holds that importance, because it is actually now housed in the same building where the Prabhat Studios once were. Now, what the impact of all of this, the impact of the National Film Festival, the setting of the FCC, and the setting up of FTII was that it offered a lot of encouragement to young and upcoming filmmakers, because now they could get that financial support that was not being given to them, because they did not want to make mainstream cinema. So what this did was that a lot of it basically propelled, it helped with a lot of experimentation in the filmmaking process itself. So a lot of experimental cinema also came to be explored by various filmmakers. The FTII of course gave skilled technicians and actors. Now before this, before the setting up of FTII, there was no institute that would offer any kind of a formal training to the people who would then later on go on to become professionals in the field of in the field of film industry, filmmaking. And therefore FTII, with the coming of FTII, skilled technicians could now become part of the filmmaking process. So importance was also being paid into as to how the entire filmmaking process was put into place. And because of all of this, a change in starting from the late 1960s all through the 70s and 80s was observed in the content of cinema, and the change that the way it was reflected was in the form of parallel cinema. So something that started in the late 60s that had originated in Bengal was now moving on into mainstream, was now moving into your Hindi cinema as well. Now let's look at some unique characteristics that are very specifically parallel cinema. Another word for parallel cinema is also alternate cinema, because alternate cinema is more like an opposition to the mainstream cinema that is that is being produced at any particular time. Now, what are the characteristics? First thing, parallel cinema was never really meant. It never really carried a mass appeal. So it was meant for a niche. There was always only a certain amount, only a certain section in the audience who would be interested in this kind of a cinema, at least early on. The topics that were being explored in these films were they were issue-based cinema. So they derived from the socio-political, socio-economical milieu of the nation or of any community and talked about those issues. Another thing was that these films were very realist in approach. So the entire concept was the film should be purposeful, the film should be meaningful, as opposed to entertainment or escapist films that were popular during the 1950s. So what it did was that it did away with the song and dance routine. So song and dance typically was meant to be a sort of enjoyment for the audiences, but what the parallel cinema did was that unless and until there was a song that would actually be required to tell the story forward or to push the story forward, there would be no song and dance sequence in the parallel cinema. It all had to be very situational. Only then, some song could be found in a parallel cinema film. So the filmmakers of parallel cinema were trying to redefine the cinematic conventions that were usually associated with the contemporary films. So the romantic plots or the light-hearted comedies, all of this was something that was not being explored by the filmmakers of parallel cinema. In fact, the themes that they explored were in stark opposition to what mainstream cinema talked about. So we had issues discussed like casteism in the society. They were also talking about the position of women and their objectification as well as subjectification by the males or by the patriarchal structure of the society. These films also talked about the class struggle and the class gap that existed at that point of time in the country. There were filmmakers who were also exploring themes on partition and the feeling of rootlessness that was associated with this pain of partition. Films also explored other themes like your communal disharmony and more or less tried to talk about the peasant class of the society. So very socialist perspective towards the kind of topics, the kind of cinema, the kind of stories that were being told in the wider screen. And again, as I mentioned earlier, the treatment of this entire story, the content of the content of these films, the treatment was very realistic in nature. So one of the first people that we have to talk about, of course, is Satyajit Ray. I'm sure you have heard his name before. He's perhaps one of the most internationally acclaimed Indian filmmakers of all times. So, and in fact, he's considered to be one of the greatest auteurs in the world of cinema. We have talked about auteur theory in one of the earlier lessons. So you understand what it means when a particular director is said to be an auteur, and Satyajit Ray was considered to be an auteur. Now, although auteur theory and the new wave cinema, specifically in France, was in complete opposition, but it's quite interesting to note that Satyajit Ray is a director who's considered both an auteur, and the kind of film that he made is considered to be your new wave cinema with regards to Indian filmmaking. So Satyajit Ray was influenced by Italian cinema. So we talked about how there was the International Film Festival in 1952, and there was a huge contingent, there was a big contingent from Italy, and a number of Italian neorealistic films were shown there. So Satyajit Ray was really influenced by those films. Jean Renoir, who was a French New Wave filmmaker, had visited India in the year 1949 and had shot extensively in Bengal. And that is the time when Ray got to interact with him and observe as well as assist in the production process of the film that that Renoir was making. And during his association with Renoir, Satyajit Ray acquired a specific taste towards what cinema should be or what cinema should do for the society. So after that, of course, Satyajit Ray went on to making films, and his first film, of course, is perhaps the most famous or the most known and the most acclaimed, which is Pather Panchali, which came out in the year 1955. It was internationally acclaimed and it was part of the Apu trilogy, which basically was the first film was Pather Panchali, which was followed by Aparajito in the year 1956, and then Apur Sansar in the year 1959. The trilogy is the coming of age story of a character of a young boy called Apu, and how these three films were inspired or influenced by Italian neorealism. He also used non-professional actors for this particular film, and a lot of shooting that was done was on location shoot. So he would travel from location to location to shoot or to get as close to reality as possible. One of the most important things is that this film was made on a shoestring budget, so very limited budget, and due to which the film could not be made in one go as it is, because Satyajit Ray had to constantly acquire funds from various sources to be able to make the film finally. Of course, when the film was made, it was acclaimed both nationally and internationally, and because for the kind of contribution that they made to the world of cinema. One thing to note here is that Satyajit Ray at that time was also criticized by some people because they said that he was trying to show only the bad aspects of India, specifically that he was trying to glorify the poor and the downtrodden of the society by trying to show the poverty in India. But that was one of the views, and eventually Satyajit Ray is remembered for his contribution to the world of cinema. He received a lot of honors, both national and international. Bharat Ratna, which is the highest civilian honor in India, he was awarded by it. He was also awarded by the Dada Saheb Phalke Award, and of course he also won the Oscar for lifetime achievement in filmmaking. What he did, like what Satyajit Ray did with his filmmaking, was that he was able to establish the norms for an alternative cinema to the existing mainstream Bombay cinema that was being fed to the audiences. Now let's move on to other directors, other filmmakers who have had an important role to play in the movement of parallel cinema. So Satyajit Ray, of course, was making Bengali films. Another Bengali filmmaker is Ritwik Ghatak. he was associated with IPTA. I have talked to you about what IPTA is and what kind of a perspective it had towards the theatre, and then automatically that particular perspective was also transferred into films. So he was associated with IPTA, and later on he made films, and he towards like after the filmmaking, he was also one of the he also took up teaching filmmaking in FTII. So this is the association that IPTA, FTI and all of these has, and which is why FTI, later on we'll talk about other filmmakers who were also students of Ritwik Ghatak, and they also eventually went on to produce cinema that could be that has been categorized under parallel cinema. So Ritwik Ghatak, in his films, you could very strongly feel like they were made on the backdrop of partition, because he himself had been at the receiving end of this migration due to partition. So the dominant themes that he explored in his films were that of displacement and disillusion, and the sense of uprooting, or the sense of having to feel like a refugee in your own country, in your own homeland. So these are the dominant themes that were apparent, that were visible in the films of Ritwik Ghatak. So films like Megha Tara and Subarna Rekha are some films that can exemplify the work, that exemplify Ritwik Ghatak's work as one of the promoters of parallel cinema. Another very important director of the times is Mrinal Sen. He too was associated with the theatre movement, with the Theatre Association of IPTA, and automatically the films that he made also had socialist themes, and he did not deliberately go for any happy ending. So which again is a mark of your mainstream cinema. One of the important films that Mrinal Sen made was Bhuvan Shom, which came out in the year 1969. Now I am saying it is one of the most important films because it's through Bhuvan Shom that this movement of parallel cinema finally arrived in the Hindi cinema. So up till now, parallel cinema was having a moment in Bengali cinema only, but with Bhuvan Shom, Mrinal Sen brought the movement into the foray of Hindi cinema. Other films that made by him were Mrigya in the year 1976 and Ek Din Achanak in the year 1989. Again, another very important film director who of course had major contributions to Hindi cinema was Shyam Benegal. I'm sure you've heard the name. He made a lot of films in Hindi cinema. So Shyam Benegal can be the person that we can say that is responsible for finally bringing mainstream, for finally bringing parallel cinema into the Hindi cinema. So Bhuvan Shom started it, but with Shyam Benegal, this particular practice it carried on. So he made a lot of films. You have Ankur that came out in the year 1973, then Nishant in 75, Bhumika in the year 1977, Manthan in the year 1976, Junu in 78, and Mandi in 83. Of course, these are not all the films that he made. There are also a lot of other films that he made, but these are representative of the kind of work that he did with parallel cinema in Hindi cinema. So now the films that Shyam Benegal was making or was putting out for the audiences, people started calling them as middle cinema, and middle cinema because these were films that talked about the issues or the things that the middle class of the society was dealing with. Now, although the middle cinema term is not something that Shyam Benegal himself approved of, he chose to call the cinema that he made as parallel cinema or as alternative cinema. This is the time, these are the kind of films that were both critically well received as well as well received by the audience, and they gained national as well as international recognition for the kind of topics that they talked about. Shyam Benegal of course went on to be conferred with a lot of awards. He was conferred with the Padma Shri and with the Padma Bhushan, and he was also of course awarded the Baba Saheb Phalke Award for his contribution to cinema. Next director, another important director of the parallel cinema is Kumar Shani. He was also an alumnus of the institute, FTII, and the films that he made were they were very experimental in nature. Now, I did talk about how the funding from FCC had helped people had helped filmmakers by going the experimental route. And of course, coming out from FTII, these students were pushed to explore and to expand their boundaries and move beyond what they understood by what cinema should be. So he made this film called Maya Darpan in the year 1972. It was not received very well by the public, but it's considered a landmark film in the history of Hindi cinema. Another film that he made was Khayal Gatha, which is again a very experimental film, and it follows a very abstract format in telling the history of the music, of the Khayal music. Another film that he made was Kasba in the year 91. Mani Kaul is another very important director of the parallel cinema era. He was also a student of Ritvik Ghatak, so an alumnus of FTII, and later on he went on to teaching the process of filmmaking at various institutes across the country as well as across the border in various other countries. So his work was very experimental in nature. So he broke the conventional narrative styles, and he used very few dialogues in his films. And one of the first films that he made was the film Uski Roti that came out in the year 1969. Other films were films like Duvidha that came out in the year 1973. I'm sure you've heard of the film Paheli that stars Rani Mukherjee and Shah Rukh Khan. So the film Duvidha, the film Paheli actually is actually based on the film Duvidha itself, because that follows the same story. So Duvidha is, we can say that Paheli is kind of a retelling of the same story that was told in the film Duvidha. Another film made by Mani Kaul is Ashad Ka Ek Din, and another film in the year that came out in the year 1980 called Satah Se Utha Hua Aadmi. Now, just by looking at the titles of these films, you can say that, you know, these films were about the common people. But these films were about the common issues that people were dealing with in their day-to-day lives, in their daily lives. Other important directors and other important films that came out in the era were Govind Nilani, whose films Akrosh, Ardh Satya and Tamas had come out. Tamas was actually a film that was made in the backdrop of the partition. Then you have Ketan Mehta, who made the film Mirch Masala in the year 1987, and M.S. Sathu, who made the film Garam Hawa in the year 1973. Again a film made against the backdrop of partition. Other filmmakers of the time are Rishikesh Mukherjee and Basu Chatterjee. Now, although I'm mentioning these names, you know, just very quickly, but they hold great importance in the movement of parallel cinema, and you can see by the kind of films that they've made. So Rishikesh Mukherjee made films like Ashirwad, Guddi, Anand, Bawarchi, Khoobsurat. Now, one thing that is interesting about these films is that as the parallel cinema movement was progressing, it was also trying to inculcate the dominant conventions in a way that these films were actually now really palatable to the audience, to the common audience. So they were no longer niche, but the kind of themes that they were still exploring and the way they were choosing to tell their stories was still very much part of the parallel cinema movement. Another director of the time that we have to talk about, of course, is Basu Chatterjee, whose films were Piya Ka Ghar in the year 1972, Ek Ruka Hua Faisla in the year 1986 and Rajnigandha in the year 1974. So these were some major film directors, some major films that were made that were part of the parallel cinema movement in Hindi cinema. And I hope you have a good understanding of what is meant by parallel cinema by now. Let us do a quick recap of what we have talked about in today's lesson. So we have delved with the concept of parallel cinema. What does it mean? Where does this term come from, parallel cinema? So we talked about the mainstream cinema of the time and how is it that the films that were now coming up that were different in the way they were treating their material that this concept of parallel cinema came up. We also talked about who were the pioneers of the Indian New Wave with regards to your Indian cinema. We discussed the basic characteristics and themes that were associated with this kind of filmmaking, and we also discussed some prominent films and filmmakers of the time. In the next lesson, we will be talking about the decline of parallel cinema. So, of course, there were things changed. So, late 60s and 70s and 80s was when the prime cinema was at its zenith. But of course, there was also a certain decline that came into effect. We will talk about that in the next lesson. We will also talk about the changes that happened after all of this was happening. So, changes that were observed in Hindi cinema in the 1970s, and we will also talk about the transformation of parallel cinema. So, how is it that parallel cinema exists today? So, it does exist today, but in what form? So, this has been the class for today. I hope you've enjoyed the lesson this time. We'll meet another time very soon.